Liberalism has come to mean wildly different things to different people. To some, it is a classical desire to limit the size of government. To others, a modern imperative to expand it. To some, it amounts to the permissive slogan, equality of opportunity, come what may. To others, the more coercive, equality of outcome for all individuals and all groups at all costs. To some, it is a universal ideology. To others, a particular description of the peculiar English soul. With me to discuss the truth of the matter is the transatlantic conservative activist Carl Benjamin, whose relationship to liberalism has undergone a dramatic shift over the last decade. Now the director of lotuseaters.com, he first came to prominence through his YouTube pseudonym, Sargon of Akkad. Carl, welcome to The Forge.
My pleasure.
So if I'm not mistaken, and I hope I didn't get your own biography wrong there, you used to describe yourself as a classical liberal at the peak of the Great Awakening, wherever we want to date that, as it were. But you have since abandoned the philosophy, in part, as I understand it, because you saw it as the logical cause of that very awakening. Could you please give us a sense of your journey from regarding wokeness as authoritarian and indeed illiberal to where you are now, indeed regarding it as, in some sense, the logical conclusion of liberalism?
Yeah, no, that's a very accurate description. I was always a kind of... Before I started my YouTube channel, I wasn't interested in politics. I dabble in philosophy and read the occasional thing, but I didn't have any firm grounding in anything in particular, because I was just living in the end of history like the rest of us, right? And then woke as an ideology, before it was called woke, started invading various spaces that I was engaged in, and it would do so in a way that I found morally objectionable. Because I was, at the time, a very orthodox liberal, I guess what we call classical liberal now, in that I thought, okay, well, we can have a non-discriminatory paradigm in which we're not going to take regard into your race, your sex, or your sexuality, or whatever it is, and just treat you on the merits of the thing. And that seemed reasonable. Actually, back in 2011, 2012, the country was a very different place. It's very reasonable, and I mean, indeed, what could you object to? And then it became apparent that, and this was at the height of sort of the new feminist wave that now has washed over the society and has just become incorporated into standard left-wing thought. You hear what were at the time very radical feminist concepts being parroted by everyone everywhere at the moment. I mean, like the term fat shaming is just something my kids will use, right? Not necessarily pejoratively either, right? That person should be fat shamed. But the point is, this is a term that actually originated in the sort of early 2010s in that wave of feminism through radical American left-wing activists. And this all happened basically at once. It was very, very quick. What it really is called is intersectional feminism, and intersectionality itself doesn't stop at feminism, and it includes any other kind of activist discipline you can think of, and this is why it dovetails so neatly with race and sexuality and disability and whatever else you want to include. And so this whole thing came upon us very quickly. Once the sort of gates had been breached, the ideology flooded through the institutions very, very swiftly. And so by 2019, 2020, it was the sort of height of the Black Lives Matter era, where massive corporations were paying homage to it and giving huge amounts of money to it. And even now, it's still the dominant paradigm within these institutions, where they just think, yes, we have to get women and minorities above white men to the top, because otherwise we're living in an unequal and fallen world of some sort. And this is a natural consequence of liberalism, because if you actually go back through the academic work of the people who invented this, you realize that they are essentially just disappointed liberals. They looked at the promises.
They being these activists.
The activists and academics. They take the promises that the liberals make in the original genesis of liberalism and say, well, why has this not been fulfilled? You promised us freedom, and yet you're saying that we can't have a gay pride parade naked down the street. Well, that's not freedom, is it? That's actually a form of constraint. Or you promised us equality, but for some reason, straight white men are the predominant number of politicians or CEOs or whatever it is we have in the country. Well, that's not equality, is it? And the reason that I think this flooded through the institution so quickly is because the logic of it is logic that aligns with what the liberals already believe. And so the sort of soft liberal types in these institutions go, well, yeah, I guess we have to do this if we want to be liberal. And so we end up with a massively overbearing moral infrastructure in society, where prior to that, liberalism was very live and let live. And it's because these people essentially judo flipped liberalism's own beliefs against itself, for their own benefit. Obviously, it's all, it's not a coincidence that the people who are being activists for these groups come from these groups. They personally benefit from all these things. And this was a weakness that was always present in liberalism. It's just that for some reason, these things take time dialectically to develop into the state that they're in. But there's no liberal counter-argument that doesn't seem archaic and superseded. So you can't go back.
Well, let's get into the intellectual history a little bit then, because you and I have discussed this before off camera, and I thought it would be interesting to get onto it on camera. And you are right that clearly there has been some kind of judo flip, however we explain that. When someone like Robert Nozick says that, justice, like a liberal account of justice demands no more than a night watchman state, and all of a sudden you have woke activists talking about, as I think one of Zoran Mamdani's administrators did the other day, about how the DEI czars should be thought of as the moral architects of our society. Like, what could be more different than night watchman state and moral architects, and yet both kind of see themselves as in some way liberal? So clearly something has happened, and it warrants an explanation. As I understand it, having spoken to you in the past and having being sort of familiar with this kind of post-liberal discussion, you locate the major weakness in liberalism as being the so-called blank slate. This is what you view as opening the door to consider it. Can
I interrupt you? Because it's not that. It's not the blank slate. The blank slate is actually a corollary of the concept of the state of nature.
Okay.
So I locate it in the state of nature, which is a hypothetical, logically derived position that the early liberals assumed mankind must have existed in. And this fiction was understood to be a fiction by the late 19th century. It was quite self-evident through archaeology that mankind had never lived in a state of nature. But yet, if you look at, say, John Rawls and his theory of justice, he's still, in the very first chapter, he says, well, I'm going to begin from the assumption of the state of nature and argue my point from that. So knowingly arguing from a falsehood is a very strange position to put a 20th century philosopher into. And Rawls was hugely influential on modern liberalism.
Certainly.
So the whole thing is kind of polluted with this falsehood, because just for anyone who doesn't know, the state of nature it's assumed that at some point man lived before society. Society is therefore a mechanical product of man's choices. He chooses to associate, and therefore. So the assumption of the man in the state of nature is that essentially he becomes born from the soil in the woodlands, wandering around and just picking fruit off the trees and fighting with animals, as Rousseau puts it. And depending on the disposition of the theorist, you get a different interpretation of what the state of nature must have been like. You've got sort of Hobbes and Montesquieu, who are like, no, the state of nature would have been quite rough. But then you've got Rousseau and Locke, who are like, well, no, the state of nature could actually have been quite good. Locke being much more of a sort of reasonable Englishman, thinks, well, we would have just cooperated. And yeah, there would have been occasionally.
Good in some ways, bad in others.
Very much.
That's sort of Locke's view of the state of nature, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Very much. He's like, he accepts that there would probably be some bad people, but most people would be very reasonable, as a well-bred Englishman would probably think. And, they just get on with their own private property, building their huts or whatever.
Sure.
And Rousseau just was under the impression that nature would furnish man with all of his needs, and so he would basically have no reason to interact with one another. But the point that the point of this is what this assumes is, and Rousseau makes an incredible argument for this in the Discourse of Inequality, that actually, if you look at the source of inequality and the source of man's problems in society, well, they're all social problems. They're all problems generated by society. Right. A savage man doesn't have gout. He's not oppressed by a king. He's not locked out of power by the rules of the aristocracy. He doesn't have to bend the knee as doff his cap as one goes past. Like all of these problems that they were identifying in their own societies at the time were excesses of society, which is correct. And so if you strip all of those things away, and he goes as far as to say, language, reading, history, education, you get a man who is essentially a universal man. And this is what blank slate is.
Stripped bare of particularities.
All particularities. And they assume that therefore there's a kind of universal human type who, before he associates with others, I mean, they've got their own theories as to how he learns language and things like this. But he's essentially an innocent babe in the woods. And it's through the association that they begin to start what they call the social contract, and that these are a series of agreed upon rules as to how society should be governed. And what that does is it makes society an entirely conscious choice of man. Whereas in reality, we actually know that no man has ever lived outside of society, because actually existing outside of society is very difficult.
Yes.
And so you can go back, I mean, even chimpanzees at the moment live in groups. Like, you know, like all of the, you know, very few of the great apes even exist on their own.
So it's no, it's okay, don't worry. So the kind of the 17th century and 18th century liberals, despite their major differences with one another, are alike in being fixated upon the state of nature, and they have different accounts, and they have different accounts of the state of nature. But the one thing that they have in common is that in the state of nature, we are radically autonomous individuals who then opt into society. So society is, to some extent, a kind of a human activity rather than something that is natural. And so I agree that is a major problem with the early modern accounts of classical liberalism. But it seems to me, when it comes to explaining how we go, as I'm keen to do, from Nozick's night watchman state to the kind of like egalitarian moral architects of society, it seems to me that the blank slate account of human differences is the one that is pivotal. And Locke does subscribe to it, and Rousseau subscribes to it, but some of them don't. Some of them don't, and later ones don't too. And we'll get into that, but yeah, go on.
There is a kind of tacit assumption that it has to be true, even if rationally they're like, well, no, I know that obviously, you know, there are different peoples of the world and they evolve differently. The philosophy is still predicated on the assumption that none of those differences matter. Right? None of those differences have any effect on what happens downstream of the initial assumptions. So even if in a sort of intellectual way they would argue, oh yeah, well, I understand that that's not true, it doesn't interfere with any of the stream of assumptions and the consequences of what they believe. The radical autonomy thing is important because it not only is it the most extreme form of liberation, but it's also the most extreme form of equality. And this is the important part of liberalism that really has, as an ideology, has created problems, because it's really difficult to conceive of any other way in which you could harmonize the concepts of liberty and equality. Because obviously in anyone's daily life, they realize that choices, and this is Nozick's great point with was it the baseball player where you give money to them depending on the ones you like. Nozick makes an incredibly compelling case that obviously any amount of liberty destroys any amount of equality. So just the choices that people make will be different, and therefore you get different outcomes, and it just stands to reason. Everyone can see that, if we're going to be free, we're not going to be equal because we're all different. So how do we harmonize the concepts of liberty and equality? Well, you have to essentially have nothing.
Yes.
You can't possess property, which is Rousseau's observation, which is correct, on the terms of the thought experiment.
Sure.
But the thought experiment itself doesn't actually reflect.
But it seems to me that what we need to explain is why people who calling themselves liberals in the mid to late 20th century became very haunted by human differentiation. So, for instance, let me try and establish what I'm trying to argue here. I view like liberalism's, like classical liberalism's, not post-war liberalism, but classical liberalism's descent into what we now colloquially describe as wokeness, as the result of historically avoidable mutations. I'm not a liberal myself, but even a classical liberal, but I view it as a result of historically avoidable mutations, not logical extensions. And I think that the intellectual history has been somewhat confounding here, because it's true that in the 17th century, you do have these kind of speculative hypotheses about the state of nature. And John Locke, in the essay Concerning Human Understanding, doesn't only make an argument for the blank slate in order to try and explain the human mind in his empiricist terms against the rationalists of his day, in I think book 2 of the essay Concerning Human Understanding. He also engages in sort of corrigible speculation about why Hottentots in Africa are different from Englishmen, and he thinks that on the basis of his kind of blank slate hypothesis that those differences must be explicable in environmental terms. In other words, he says something along the lines of, who's to know if a Hottentot had gone to Oxford University, he might be the finest mathematician in the land. He says something along those lines.
It's sort of thing that David Lammy can say.
Exactly. In the essay concerning human understanding. But I think that we need to have a little bit of intellectual charity for people like Locke, because he was writing 2 centuries or so before the rise of genetics and 3 centuries before the rise of neuroscience. And by the 19th century, once we get into the 19th century, you do have classical liberals, forgotten names like Herbert Spencer today, making like moral liberal arguments for the kind of government that he wants to see, his account of government, but mixing it with a kind of group realism about human nature that has the distinct virtue, as far as I'm concerned, in being post-Darwinian but pre-Hitlerian. And I think we can regard that as the sort of soft spot of the classical liberal tradition, and it's been forgotten today because by the 19th century, the blank slate was simply untenable as a matter of empiricism, which is exactly what Locke is trying to defend.
Yes.
So if Locke had been around 300 years later on his own account of knowledge, he would be forced to ditch the blank slate. But I don't think it's not obvious to me that he would also have to shed all of his liberal intuitions. In other words, as a matter of logic, we'll get to it, but my claim is that as a matter of logic, if not as a matter of the contingencies of intellectual history, classical liberalism, though I'm not a classical liberal, it can coexist with an understanding of the differences that are inherent in human nature. And then all of a sudden, we can just all be Spencerian liberals if we want to be.
That would be lovely. And that was what I wanted when I was a liberal. But it became apparent that there's no escaping the dialectic. If you have a series of, if your concept of society and the government and the state in the world is predicated on a series of logical propositions, then you have to follow the logic through. It doesn't have to be that you are proposing a logical, necessary derivation of what is to what ought to be. But if you are doing that, then it's very easy for someone to say, well, why can't I just force you through inference to the next stage of what you're saying? Because what you are right that Locke would have to, at this point, give up essentially everything that he believed. Right.
Well, that's not my claim, but maybe that is correct. Well, that's not my claim.
Because I noticed you used their inclinations versus the logic, right? So a person's inclination is, you did, but it's okay.
No, I don't remember saying that, but okay.
I'm pretty sure you said, didn't you say his inclinations or their preferences or something like that?
Don't know.
I'm pretty sure you did.
We'll check the tape.
We can.
But make the point, sorry.
I'm pretty sure you did. And that's the thing, I think the average Englishman has got very liberal preferences and inclinations.
I said intuitions, sorry. I said intuitions.
Sorry. So and the average, and because liberalism as a philosophy, as an ideology, has been derived from the English experience of politics.
I certainly agree with that.
Which is obviously true, right? It's not controversial at all.
No.
And so it's not surprising that the average Englishman does have a series of intuitions that you would call liberal, broadly. But that doesn't mean they are philosophically liberal, and therefore they're not propositional, and therefore you can't derive conclusions from them, right? They don't begin in a theoretical example of a state of nature or something. That begins in a historical fact that, the Baron sat King John down at Runnymede in 1215 and by the point of the sword forced him to guarantee the rights of Englishmen to a jury trial, David. I
disagree with that, as you'll see in our next restoration paper, but go on.
Whatever, whatever they believe, right? They've got in their mind, they've got a concrete historical phenomenon which isn't propositional, it's just factual. And through the procession of time and the inheritance of the continuity of the country, they've inherited a suite of rights and moral standing that they think is just correct. And it's not necessarily rational or logical. It's just everyone feels that this is the correct way to do things. But that's not what liberalism is. Liberalism begins with a premise. And from the premise, it derives definite conclusions. And the premise is we were maximally free and maximally equal. And therefore, we can do whatever we want with that. In fact, it might not be whatever we want. Maybe we have necessary, inevitable places we have to go with that. But the point being is not only is that not true, but it itself is a mythology. And what mythologies are value-setting stories. So for the same reason that Alexander the Great slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow and went on to conquer the Persian Empire is the same reason that the mythology of the state of nature is driving wokeness now. So the values are unchallengeable, right? No no one on the liberal side of the scale can question whether we should have liberty or equality. The question is, well, to what extent, to what we're prepared to sacrifice to liberty and equality. And so the truest liberal is the person really who's prepared to sacrifice the most. And that's the same with any value system and any mythology. And so as an ideology, it's got its mythological beginnings. And you can see throughout the course and evolution of liberalism how the people who are using it for a reason. It's a tool to change society in ways that I'm not going to argue are bad. There's definite benefits to, say, limited government. There's definite benefits to a large degree of personal liberty and political equality. There's definite benefits to these things. But in the context that they were being advanced, they were expressly political demands based on a value system drawn from a mythology. And the problem with the sort of Nozick level classical liberals is that they are in a previous paradigm's version of those demands. The demands that were made in, say, the 18th century or the 19th century were not very crazy because comparatively the society they'd come out of was actually very stifling. And so you didn't need to make insane demands. I mean, don't get me wrong, a lot of the demands they were making at the time seemed insane to the societies in which they were operating. What you want to give the franchise to people who can't read, like that's a mad statement. It's a mad statement. And yet 100 years later, they have it, right?
You're talking about the 18th century, though?
Or whichever, wherever.
But it's funny, though, because, I mean, again...
it is.
I suppose what I'm struck by, and so, but let me be very clear. I use the word moral intuitions for a reason, and because it seems to me like you and I both have subscribe to a very similar theory of knowledge, as applied to politics, in that we understand that it is very imprudent to abstract premises and principles and other such propositional formulae from the complex social and historical arrangements in which they are enmeshed, and then thinking that they are enough to sort of just fly on their own. Yeah. That's why in my monologue, I talked about how, what is liberalism? Is it a universal ideology, or it is a description of the peculiarities of the English soul? And I'm much more drawn to the latter.
Right.
So I do accept that I am not in favour. One of the reasons I'm not a classical liberal is because I don't think I'm a good Aristotelian and a good Burke on these things. I don't think that we can live on abstractions alone. What I'm interested in, though, I do nevertheless confess to being interested in strict logical relations between ideas, and it just seems to me like a pretty obvious fact, like particularly when you study the history, that the liberal tradition is so heterogeneous. It contains figures as various on the one hand as Rawls, who has some egalitarian intuitions, probably indebted to some kind of lingering blank slatism in Rawls's account of government. But then you also have these, again, forgotten 19th century names like Herbert Spencer, who would be on the prevent watch list if he was around today, because he held like strictly realistic views about group differences and human nature, which since the Second World War have been heavily taboo. So it seems to me that what in terms of liberalism, classical liberalism mutating into wokeness, we are talking there about something much more like post-war liberalism having already contaminated the liberal baggage with fears about group differences.
But we're quite far beyond that, though, because actually wokeness assumes group differences. Right?
But it assumes they can be corrected for as well, though, through remedial action.
Of course.
And it thinks that those group differences are attributable to environmental factors that can be retwigged.
Technically, it's not wrong. The state is a very powerful entity, and it could, redistribute wealth and property along these lines to compensate for differences. I mean, that's technically doable.
Yes.
It's just horrifically unjust.
Yes.
But the stretch that we're missing here is the context in which the ideas are developed. Because for example, someone like John Locke, he's arguing against the absolute power of kings. Right? Mm-hmm. That's the purpose of liberalism for him. Mm-hmm. That's not really a conversation we're having now. No. We're having conversations that are corollaries of this, right? And so what he's arguing for really is a chosen and constructed society, a consciously constructed society,
Yes.
right? Now that's an assumption that is built into everything we do now.
Yes.
But prior to that, the dominant paradigm is the Robert Filmer paradigm of actually this is all instantiated by God and it's actually beyond our control.
Yes.
And so the arguments he makes are relative to the arguments that he has to deal with.
Correct.
Right? So the philosophy kind of unfolds through history, right? And so this is why you have people of, like, was it Herbert Spencer, was it? I'm just not familiar with it.
He wrote
he's forgotten.
He was, forgotten. I won't go on it. But he was a bit of a polymath, 19th century polymath, post-Darwinian, and he was very taken in by kind of scientific advances of the Victorian age of the 19th century, an Englishman, but who also held, maybe as an Englishman, very sort of classically liberal intuitions about the state, its remit, the importance of the individual. And he kind of reframed, like, not a blank slatist at all, believed in human nature, believed that it wasn't infinitely malleable, believed that there existed group differences that were attributable to evolutionary processes and all the rest of it. But he saw his liberalism as sort of being consistent with the rejection of the blank slate, because he thought that it's by leaving people alone that you allow nature to take its proper course.
And he's correct. Yeah. That's a very traditionally English perspective.
The Man versus the State is the book in which he develops this idea.
Yeah, and this is a consequence of the sort of position of Hobbes moving into the position of Locke. Right. This is downstream of that, which is totally fine. And as an Englishman, obviously I agree with it, but I don't agree that is exclusive to liberalism. You don't have to be a liberal.
Oh, I agree with that. Yeah,
obviously, it doesn't have a monopoly on that position.
Correct.
And if you take it in isolation and say, well, look, Harrison, as an Englishman, do you think that you have a series of rights that you have inherited through your lineage from the history and events of England? You go, well, yes, obviously I do. Do you believe that once upon a time your ancestors wandered around in the woods all alone? Yeah. No, of course I believe that.
To be clear, my main complaint is that they haven't been handed down to me.
That's exactly why we're here, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
So David Lavey is currently in the process of removing them.
Indeed, yes.
So anyway, the point being, so you none of the things that liberalism lays claim to, it has exclusive ownership of.
Completely agree with that.
And it's not the progenitor of these things either, right? But what it does is it creates a coherent narrative that is a series of, it begins with the mythology that is the premise, and then it has a series of logical arguments. And we can see how this is processed through history. And so you get to John Locke, where you've got the liberal logical argument for freedom, but John Locke is kind of lazy and just kind of lets the equality argument go. He just says, well, we're not going to really have equality. What difference does it make? And it's like, okay, well, to you, Mr. 130 IQ Anglo aristocrat, maybe the equality thing doesn't matter that much, but someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, it really matters. And he will come along with a different philosophy 100 years after you, and we are now in that paradigm and not your paradigm. And so the people, the sort of Nozick types, they kind of look like dinosaurs.
Yes.
Because Rousseau has one up them. Because Rousseau has a different attitude towards the construction of society as well. He thinks that society is something that happened to man rather than something man did to himself.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's very interesting how he's like, well, suddenly he just finds himself in houses and in cities and this. And you can see suddenly how people are victims of society.
But I do think it's really, I've already kind of said this, but I suppose I will labour the point a little. So you say that people address their time, they necessarily do so. And like Locke, as you know, like modern philosophy has been primarily concerned with, up until the mid 20th century, with the theory of knowledge. How do we know? What do we know? What can we claim to know? How can we put knowledge on a secure footing, with secure foundations? And people like Descartes came along, and people like Spinoza and people like Leibniz, and these people are classically classed as the rationalists, who think that it's by like reflecting upon our own innate concepts in our mind and building upon those that we've come to secure knowledge of the world, because the world itself is not a trustworthy guide to knowledge,
and
because we can be mistaken. Our senses aren't trustworthy. Whereas the empiricists, Locke being the chief one of the 17th century, their motto was like, nothing is in the intellect that was not first in the senses. In other words, we come to knowledge of the world by engagement with it. And it's in this context that Locke advances the blank slate. People forget that. Like he says, imagine the mind is nothing but a white bit of paper. How then comes it to be furnished? I answer in one word: experience. So given that I regard this as a great irony of history, given that our now fairly secure knowledge about the untenability of the blank slate is itself something that we owe to the breakthroughs of empirical science. And Steven Pinker, who's a very sober, kind of left liberal psychologist, details all of them in his book, The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature. Doesn't really affect his liberalism, by the way, which is interesting.
It's remarkable, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting.
Remarkable.
I regard that as, I'm not actually that surprised given the argument that I've been making here. Like Locke himself, on his own theory of knowledge, which is what he was primarily concerned with, he was much more bothered about that than he was about political theory. He would be forced to accept that the blank slate is an untenable account of human nature with which to be working politically. And it seems to me that once the blank slate is off the table, there is just nothing logical. It could still happen as a matter of historical mutation, but there's nothing logical about the classical liberal outlook mutating into wokeness.
But this is why discussion of the differences of human biological groups is so taboo.
Yeah.
Because it is, you are correct, if we are not all the same, then we can't have universal rules that treat us all the same, because that actually doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And you are absolutely right. It just undoes all of liberalism after that, because there's a big edifice built on this one key thing, and that one key thing is built on the state of nature. And so you've got this entire thing that if that's knocked out, then you're right, the whole thing collapses. But that's why it's taboo. But this...
Do you not think it's taboo because of the Second World War? More so than because of the fear that the foundational pillars of the 17th century will crumble?
Well, I think what it is after the Second World War, it was really liberalism's triumph. Liberalism and communism. You've got the great three Enlightenment ideologies. And in a way, you can kind of argue that they're all very similar, at least conceptually. They all believe that actually the world is rational, the world can and should be understood.
Very quickly, I'm guessing you're here talking about fascism, communism, and liberalism.
Correct.
Yeah, right.
The world can be rationally understood and therefore can be rationally ordered by the state. And so society, being something that we have control over, can be something that can be reorganized and reordered as we like. The liberals have the softest view on this, as in, maybe, but we've got a tradition of being against the king, having excess dominion over the country and whatnot. But after World War II, you have the collapse of fascism. So the idea of the state structuring itself for power doesn't work. But you have then communism and liberalism both trying to solve the same problems. And you'll notice that actually they're kind of harmonizing at this point. The liberal countries are excessively socialist, and notice that communist China is becoming excessively capitalist. But they're both harmonizing into the same position, which is, the state is going to do a lot of things, but there will be some area for free enterprise, because it's become apparent that actually pure communism doesn't work. But in many ways, pure liberalism doesn't work either.
Well, don't worry, I don't agree with that.
But even in the sort of classical sense, right? Even if you have an absolutely minimalistic state, you get the sort of Victorian David Copperfield sort of environment where people after World War II were like, no, we want a welfare state. We want the NHS. We want to make sure that there isn't this, the very bottom of society can be raised up a bit, because this was horrible, horrible depredation. The world's largest empire, the richest country in the world, and yet we've got people living like this. And you can understand their argument, right? The argument has teeth. You can understand why people in that time demanded these things, and rightfully so. They just fought the world's worst war, and it's like, no, we're not coming home to this poverty. We're not having this afterwards. So you can understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you make. In fact, it sounds to me like, forgive me if I was misunderstanding you, I don't think I was. You were basically saying there that communism, fascism, and liberalism, despite their differences, no doubt, they all basically view society as a work of human mechanics.
Yes, they all have the same fundamental sort of original liberal Enlightenment view.
I mean, I do need to say, as a matter, like, there are. I don't like it when the Enlightenment's cheerleaders, like Steven Pinker, to mention him again in his book Enlightenment Now, like capital E Enlightenment, it was all one thing.
I know, I'm being lazy.
And I don't like it when castigators do that either. whether it's you or David Bentley Hart or
I realise I'm summarising a lot.
Yeah, because I mean, like someone like David Hume is clearly an Enlightenment figure,
yes,
and yet he did not subscribe to a state of nature account of the human person.
There were several that didn't.
He was more Augustinian and Aristotelian in thinking that human society was natural. But he was also quite liberal, actually.
I'll call it liberal then,
in terms of his outlook.
To be more specific.
All right, okay, yeah.
But even then, these people didn't call themselves liberals. Like the term liberalism politically was first used in
1850s.
No, 1809, I think it was.
Oh, in France.
Spain.
Really?
Yeah, to describe the Spanish liberal insurrectionaries against the Spanish king.
Interesting.
Interesting. By about the 1830s, it had entered the English lexicon.
I thought it came in the 1850s in England. Yeah. You may be right. Okay, that's it.
No, I looked into it specifically for my master's.
Oh, right.
I had to find out.
Have you finished that now, by the way?
I have, yeah.
Oh, right.
But anyway, the point being, we can say that this is the liberal assumption. And the thing is, even where the communists and fascists disagree with the liberals, I mean, none of the communists believed in the state of nature, but they inherit the value set of the state of nature regardless. Like Marx, Engels, Kropotkin is really guilty of this, because in Kropotkin's day, by the end of the 19th century, the archaeology had all been done. And so in his book, Mutual Aid, he just lays, and Mutual Aid is a great book, actually. And what it is an anti-communist book, because in Mutual Aid, he lays out, humans were never in the state of nature. There was no equality or liberty. What there was is essentially groups of tribes, hierarchical organizations that were struggling to survive against a really hostile wilderness. And they worked together, I mean, Mutual Aid being the theme of the book, they worked together to make sure that everyone survived and carried on. And it's like, okay, well then why would we be communists? Because what are you talking about? We're not having equality in any way, and they don't really have liberty. What they have is a howling wilderness full of teeth that they're afraid of. So actually order and structure and security would be the things that they would value.
Yes.
Like, from their own perspective, the early man did not value liberty. Liberty was a terrible curse.
It was basically a byword for insecurity.
Exactly. It was a swift death, right? And this is why in the ancient world it was a punishment. No, you're ostracized, you're exiled from the society. No, good luck. And people don't understand in the modern era, the modern era where you've got, one of the great things about capitalism is the anonymization of society, right? As in you can just go to any town in the country and rent a room, right? You can't do that in 2000 BC. If you're not a member of that tribe, they're not taking you in. Why would they take you in? You're on your own. Good luck, And so the issues that these men would have had are very different to the issues that the 19th century sort of communists had. But the communists at no point challenge the assumptions of liberty and equality. They inherit the liberal assumptions, the liberal values, even while rejecting the way that they came to these values. And for some reason, just none of them said, well, is this really what we're after then? At what point do we admit that, okay, if blank slate isn't true, if the state of nature isn't true, where are we going? And yet Marx and Engels uncritically adopt these, Kropotkin uncritically adopts these. Rawls uncritically adopts the values. And so if the values are built on a false mythology, then they're not going to produce something that is true, real, and good. They're going to produce something artificial. They're going to produce something that is opposed to what humans actually need and was opposed to human nature. And this is where we have found ourselves now. And so we've gone through the 20th century and the sort of slow normalization of communism and liberalism into whatever we call it now. I don't even know what we want to call what's happening now, the sort of the managed command economy, right? Where the values that underpin these are expressly liberal values, because what they're trying to do is create freedom in a certain compass and equality to a certain degree. So, for example, Dan did a video the other day talking about how in Britain, the average wages are somewhere between 30 and 50,000.
You mean you're talking about Dan Tubbs at the Lotus Eaters?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. He's an economist, and this is the sort of thing that fascinates him. That the average income is somewhere between 30 and 50,000, because if you're above that, obviously your taxes start really rising to the point where it's just not worth earning any money. But if you're below that, even if you're working, the government tops up your wages, so you're in this band. So you're not equal, but you are very equal in a historic sort of sense. And this is a sort of anti-freedom position. So you are free, and the interpretations of freedom, of course, change. But you're free to engage in any kind of licentiousness you want, practically. but you're not free to earn more money than your neighbor, right? Like you're not really free to do that because the state will intercede. So you've got and another thing as well with the concept of universal human rights, right? So this is another liberal innovation that has dramatic downstream consequences that no one really thought about. So the rights of Englishmen make a lot of sense. They're historically contingent, they're fixed. You can point to the people that they are residual in and why those people have them.
And they've been historically negotiated.
They are a product of historical negotiation, and they make a lot of sense. They're also something that a lot of people have been envious of, right? Because, I mean, why wouldn't you be? If you're in 17th century France, yeah, look at the English. Why do they get to have habeas corpus? Why do they get to have jury trials? Why do they get to have what was at the time an incredible amount of political freedom? Why is it that the British Empire was mostly a private endeavor? Like, that's not possible in most other times and places. Like, look at the Roman Empire. No, it's the state. Like, it's Pompey conquering the East. Well, he's part of the triumvirate. You know, it's Julius Caesar conquering Gaul.
Even our manner of conquest was permissive.
Incredibly. Right? It was literally, I mean, you can find now.
Do your thing, lads. Yeah.
You can find now, like, newspaper articles, like adverts, wanted, 200 strong men, high risk of death, but maybe great glory and treasure. And it's just like, because you were free, you could go and do this. And it was a very enviable thing, right, to people in France who were in a strictly hierarchical, almost caste system. And so it's just like, okay, well, yeah, I would like what they have, but you have to rationalize how you're going to get there, right? And you can't say, well, I'd like the rights of Englishmen, please, because they'd be like, well, you're a Frenchman.
Yeah,
you're a German.
It's not a simple copy and paste job.
No, it's not. And the abstraction of liberalism away from the rights of Englishmen into the universal right to man.
Yeah, totally agree with this, yeah.
This is a powerful thing, right? And this is what Burke puts in his reflection on the revolution. He's like, in the principle of liberty, I see a powerful spirit, but I don't know where it goes.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
And he was very wise to be nervous about that, because of course then it leads into the French Revolution, which he predicts almost word for word in advance of it. And so what you have is the desire for a certain outcome being applied to a society that doesn't have the historic infrastructure to get there. Yeah. And this is why the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution all take on the same sort of aspects. Oh no, these are levelers. These are leveling revolutions, because none of the society brought us to the point of English liberty. And so, okay, well, we've just got to get rid of all of this then. And it's like, okay, but that's insane. That's a hugely damaging thing. And what it does is it makes the government the guarantor of your rights. That's not how it works. We're against the government. The government is the infringer of our rights. But now the government has found itself as the guarantor of our rights, which is like, okay, that's kind of like an abusive relationship. Yeah,
they become a form of state largesse rather than something natural or even inherited.
Exactly. It should be local communities resisting centralized authority. And that's what it would be if it wasn't for the way that the modern state operates. Because the modern state says, okay, well, universal rights for everyone under every condition all the time. And I'm going to bring in a bunch of foreigners. They have the same rights as you. And now I have to defend them against you because your majority demographic power is actually infringing on their right to religion or on their right to free speech or whatever, their right to not be discriminated against, all sorts of things. And so now the government has actually positioned itself as the defender of these minorities against the majority. And this is why you've got, 12,000 people a year processed through the courts or whatever, however many it is, in defense of a minority. So the government has actually kind of flipped itself into being essentially kind of the victim of the wider society. And this whole thing is only possible through liberal philosophy. Yeah.
Well, rights understood as a kind of like generous state guaranteed, state underwritten largesse necessarily burden the state. And by extension burden in our back to front societies the people who are forced to subsidize the state in its activities, many of which actually are not in our interests.
What it does though, just a quick thing on that. What it does though is it conceptually renders the people being oppressed by the state as the oppressors of the people the state is trying to protect. Right? So it creates a demented view of the state takes on a demented view of its own responsibilities.
Oh, yes.
So the state is there. No, I have to, like, and we saw this at Southport where Keir Starmer's like, right, 24-hour courts, you are going down for this. And it's like, well, what happened? Well, these people have had foreigners imposed on them, and those foreigners are killing their children.
Yes.
The state's choice, this was a matter of government policy to inflict horror on the people of England, and the state accuses them of being the oppressors of the people who are victimizing them. And so it's a demented interpretation of what governance is, and this is only possible through the liberal view of human rights.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, though, I suppose the key thing that I want to establish here is that the liberal tradition is a very varied and multifaceted one, and just as, I don't know, someone like Lord Hermer can cite some of its most sort of historically rich and salient features in defense of his human rights radicalism and in defense of open borders and all sorts of other horrors that we wouldn't want to be associated with. It is also possible for people to cite aspects of the liberal tradition and to call themselves liberals. Again, I'm not one, but to call themselves liberals and say, no. Another thing that Locke talks about is the consent of the governed. That seems quite important. The American founding fathers, who were are widely understood to have been classical liberals, imposed very strict criteria on who could and who could not become an American in their 1790 Naturalization Act. Even John Stuart Mill himself, in his considerations on representative government, he has a whole section on nationality, on the concept of nations, in which he still views nations as a kind of product of human artifice. So the idea that it's a work of mechanics rather than something natural, it does survive, and I disagree with Locke with John Stuart Mill on that. But he makes a defense of nations on the basis of one of the most foundational principles of liberalism, namely freedom of association. Like the way I would phrase it today, and you have people not very well known philosophers like I forget his name, so I won't say his name, but you put it this way. Like, how can I be free to associate with whomever I please, which is a fundamental liberal principle, or is one of them at least, if I'm not allowed to assert my right not to be involuntarily replaced in my own country? I mean, no members of a nation can, strictly speaking, be free to associate if they are prone to being replaced without their consent.
But you can see you can see why this was doomed to fail, right? Because
what was doomed to fail?
This position that you're putting out. Because I mean, obviously, I agree with it, right?
Oh, no, sure, yeah.
You know, obviously, as an Englishman, again, this is just naturally my position on almost anything. But you can see from its own standards why it's doomed to fail. Because, okay, you've assumed a kind of there's a universal right to freedom of association, but you are trying to particularize that only to one nation, and so it's very easy for a more orthodox and doctrinaire liberal to say, yeah, no, open borders is freedom of association, right? Because what they're saying is you don't have any particular claim to this country because, well, all of these rights are universal. So why doesn't a Somali have the right to freely associate in Birmingham?
For the same reason that I don't have the freedom to associate with your family by coming to tea when invited.
But you
freedom of association means, so like the point that I can't remember the exact phrasing. It's very ornate 19th century prose, but Mill says something along the lines of like a crucial part of the self in self-determination is the right to exercise authority over what the self consists in.
Sure.
And so we are like freedom to associate includes the freedom to decide the terms of membership.
But fundamentally, the nation is an unchosen form of association.
No, indeed, this is a problem.
Well, this is a problem.
No, that's why I said
liberalism.
That's why I said I reject Mill's account of how the nation comes to be.
Sure, but I appreciate what he's trying to argue.
Once it does exist, however we think it came to be, whether we agree with Mill, which I don't, or whether. But once it exists, then freedom of association would, at scale, mean not open borders.
Or it means the abolition of countries. Because the modern liberals are using freedom of association to abolish our countries. Yeah,
but they are. My point is that they are very, very vulnerable to counter citation.
Sure, but the thing is,
and I think it's not. I don't think it's obvious who's correct.
Well, from
a liberal worldview.
Well, from the liberal perspective, obviously, it's the open borders.
Oh, I'm not so sure about that.
No, they're absolutely sure because you are trying to insert a non-liberal clause in the liberal argument, and I mean, don't get me wrong. you can. But if you are an orthodox doctrinaire liberal, that's something you have to do outside of liberalism, right? So you've brought the idea of the nation from outside of liberalism, because liberalism doesn't recognize nations. It recognizes atomized individuals who have freedom and equality. And that is the ultimate aim of what they're trying to achieve with all of liberal thought and activism and philosophizing. So you bringing in something that is exclusionary, particular, and unchosen is heretical.
I don't agree with this. Yeah, because 19th century liberals viewed the nation. Again, I don't agree.
Yeah, but they're very much a product of their time.
No, fine. But my point is that 19th century individuals, in my view, wielding logic that makes sense on its own terms, viewed nations as basically effectively authored into being by individual wishes and individual desires. Now, that would not be my account. I view the nation as much more of an inherited natural fact than a kind of voluntarist endeavor. But like, again, on the liberal worldview, once you have established a nation, and once individuals have agreed to establish a nation, they do have a right, using their established processes for decision making, rather like a club. You know, if I set up a chess club, and on the liberal worldview, if I want to say, for whatever reason, that's a stupid thing to do, but like left-handed players are not allowed in this club, the liberal technically might say, well, that is not itself liberal criteria, but I, as a liberal, believing in freedom of association, including freedom of association in ways that I regard as somewhat retarded, that is permissible. And so for the liberal, it is true, the nation is a kind of club into which we opt, but once the club exists, it is up to existing members to establish who can come in, who cannot. And so people like Mill thought that liberals should use that. Thought that 19th century Englishmen should use that power that they had discerningly, which is why Mill was not in favour of open borders. So,
but this is a particular frame of the unfolding of the liberal ideal, right? So I mean, you are correct on the terms you've laid out there, but you have a non-liberal section here that the liberal will not want to allow to endure, right? So okay, this is true, but I'm trying to reach something. There's a telos in liberalism, right? And I'm not happy that your non-liberal barricade is going to remain there. It may be a contingent necessity in reality, especially in the 19th century or wherever, that obviously a nation exists, and so we just have to deal with the world how it is. But we're not going to get to the John Lennon ideal by allowing that to continue indefinitely. And the logic of liberalism actually doesn't sanction nations in the way that we think of nations. The logic of liberalism sanctions the abolition of nations, actually. And we should be abolishing nations. And so this is why liberals turn into globalists. They think that the entire human race is essentially of one substance, should be in the same polity, and should have the same rights. And
I think,
it's not that these other chaps are bad people or not liberals, but whether or not is comprehensively liberal. They concede to reality a series of things. Well, I don't know whether you noticed, but the most orthodox liberals concede very little to reality these days, because it begins in something that's fictional and carries on in this stretch. And okay, reality at certain points intercedes, but the more society develops, the more technologically advanced we become, the more actually the less the liberal needs to concede to reality. And this is, I think, why we found ourselves in the position we're in now. Because I mean, like the most liberal thing at the moment is the stigmatization of the body itself. Like the mind trapped in this fleshy prison that, that is a man, but I feel like a woman or whatever. Like the drive for the liberation of the will is what underpins basically all of it.
Let me say that, how to put this, I think we've struck upon our major disagreement. Then I don't actually think that liberalism, construed in a uniform way, has a single logic,
okay.
and I suppose that's kind of what I've been trying to emphasize throughout the kind of like variety and the riotous and conflicting nature of the liberal tradition, which I view as richer in having what we might sort of lots of different teloses rather than
what other telos does it have?
Well, I would draw a distinction between I think this is a useful distinction between what I would call war, by which I mean pre-Second World War, classical liberalism, which I haven't been defending throughout, but which I've been trying to give a good hearing for throughout, and what we might call post-war curative liberalism. You call it comprehensive. I think, who said that again? Who coined the term comprehensive liberalism? There's a female academic in the 70s who did.
I've just been using it myself because I can't think of a better term for it. It's full spectrum liberalism.
I like the word curative because curative liberalism, post-war curative liberalism, because it assumes that the world as we find it, as you've been sort of hinting at there, is something to be resolved, something to be remedied through concerted action. And once you have that view of liberalism, like Rousseau's, people should be forced to be free.
Correct.
Then it's understandable why something which is supposed to be permissive, liberalism, leads to moral architects running your society, managerial, faceless bureaucrats saying, well, no, you're not properly free until you do what I want you to do. It's easy to see because they might say, yes, the woman who wants to have 6 children, yes, she may think that she's free, but the very fact that she has that perspective is itself traceable to the fact that she's not free, and I can show her not to be free, and I can engage in all sorts of psychobabble, and it's my job as the kind of benevolent managerial dictator to cure her of that and make her truly free, so that she starts sterilizing herself and ruining all of her relationships. So you do have that liberalism. I don't dispute that there is the logic of curative liberalism, as I call it, leads where you fear.
It's always been curative.
Okay, well, your view is that it's always been curative.
Yes,
it's never been classical.
No. What we
in the sense that
what we call the classical liberalism was curative against the Filmarian authoritarian society, right? The divine right of kings society. Locke's classical liberalism was curative to that.
Yes.
And that becomes the new paradigm that carries on. But then other problems emerge. And so you get the sort of modern interpretations of liberalism that are curative to and Mandani put this brilliantly. It's like the coldness of individualism and the warmth of collectivism. Yeah. Now, I like the coldness of individualism, right? I don't want the government messing with me. Yeah. I don't want some bureaucrat, coming along and, screwing around my stuff. But I can't say that I'm more liberal than him on those grounds, because what he's trying to do is curatively provide the rights and resources, so the liberty and equality that was promised right at the beginning. Yeah. It's just, it takes on a different interpretation for each phase. And the reason we call it classical liberalism is because literally it's a holdover from the 19th century, and it's one that on the merits I agree with, actually. It's just, it's still built on the same foundation. And people like Mandami or whoever can just come along and say, well, that may have been true then, but it's not true now, and we need something else. I
think your description of Locke is a slightly mischievous use of the term curative liberalism, because of course anyone who has a worldview and thinks that there are certain things that need to change in their current form would by this definition be subscribing to a curative worldview.
No, hang on, no. That's a mischaracterization.
Well, but the point I'm trying to make is that it's true that as far as Locke was concerned in the 17th century, what is now described as Lockean liberalism, he did obviously, as we've talked about, he didn't use that term himself. Like he did see himself as trying to set things right, to try and approximate a truer understanding of government as it should be, and all the rest of it. So it is true that in his own context, he was rebelling against he was rebelling against certain inherited political status quo that he thought was wrong. But it seems to me that he thought that was best remedied by a proper moral weighting, like by assigning proper moral weight to the importance of certain values, which today we think of as being liberal values, whether it's sort of free speech, freedom of association, the kind of classical liberal freedoms, limited government and all the rest of it. And it seems to me that it's like, that is classical liberalism. And it doesn't have to be curative to the point of wanting to the point of licensing a new kind of managerial bureaucracy. And I don't think that Locke would have thought it had to be, particularly given that, as we've already acknowledged, by this point, he's no longer cleaving to the blank slate. So he would have no reason to be particularly...
I don't think he'd be a liberal at this point.
Well, yeah, but he would have no reason. He would have no reason to be haunted by inequality today in the way that he might have done in the 17th century.
He wasn't haunted by inequality in the 17th
Well, no, sure, but people who are blank slatists today, who are liberals, are, because they think, why have we not equalized outcomes yet if we're all the same? saying. But if you're not a blank slatist, and I think that blank slatism is logically separable from liberalism, you don't have to have that fear.
Sure, that's true. I mean, Locke wasn't really that perturbed by equality.
You're right, yeah.
Beyond the fixed nature of society, right? But I mean, England had a class hierarchy, but it wasn't nearly as rigid as some. I mean, France is a great continental example, right? So for Locke, it was really about personal freedom.
Yeah.
But this is curative in that there is an objective a priori assumption in the mind of the liberal that there is a particular way that things ought to be, and what they are doing in their own time and context is relationally, comparatively to what already currently exists, proposing something that they think would be a better attempt to arrive at the conceptual correct place.
Can I ask you a question here?
Yes.
So are you saying then that every like, I'm against political abstractions. I don't think they're useful.
Yeah.
I don't think they're workable. I think they're pragmatic. But is your view then that anything that begins from abstractions in an idealist way is curative?
I think we could say so,
right,
because
okay.
what you're doing is you're looking at the current state of affairs in the same way that a doctor would look at a broken leg and say, right, okay, I know your leg is not supposed to be broken, and therefore we need to get it to this position, right? So in the abstract, he's got an a priori assumption of what things should look like, and he's looking at reality and going, right, okay, I could change this to get to here, I'll splint on it, whatever. Any political philosophy could be looked at that way. I mean, look at ISIS is a great example, actually, of an extreme curative philosophy. It looks at the debased world that was ironically perverted by liberalism through the 18th and 19th centuries, and they come up with a very hardline interpretation of Sharia law. Why? To get back to what they thought Muhammad was living like in the 17th century, right? So they have their own curative way, and it's not the same as simply what we could call progress, right? People assume progress and liberalism go hand in hand, but that's not necessarily true at all, actually, right? I mean, like the Romans very clearly had a sense of progress in their own civilization. Like, was it Augustus said, I found Rome a city of brick and I left it a city of marble, right? He understands that he has built something that didn't previously exist. There wasn't a model in his mind, I need a marble Rome. No. You know, this isn't about restoring Rome to a proper thing. He was just proud of the riches and the magnificence he'd managed to, and same with Periclean Athens as well. Like when he builds the Parthenon, like they didn't know that this, they didn't think, oh, we've got a goal we're trying to attain. It was just, we can be rich, magnificent, and powerful, and we are. And look at us now, you know. But there wasn't an a priori model they were trying to arrive at. It was just what they could do as progress within their own sphere. For us, progress takes on a different meaning, that there is a definite teleological end to progress, and that is the liberation and equalization of all people, right? That's what the liberals consider progress to be. So again, progress is another one of those words where it's like rights. It's like, well, there are rights and progress, and then there's liberal rights and progress, and they're all going to the same place. It's all teleological. And so from Locke's position, he's like, how can I enhance, for Locke, primarily liberty, but also equality in a very secondary and lazy way? How can I get there? Well, you know, basically limited government, freedom of association, private property, and that will create a maximally free society. We probably won't be very equal, but I'm not very bothered about that. And therefore, Rousseau takes on extra dimensions, saying, okay, actually, I'd like a bit more equality. So actually, what has to happen to make this come about, for Rousseau in particular, is that the state has to be a replacement for nature itself. So everything that the nature provided to mankind, the state has to ensure.
I probably should have been clear throughout, and no doubt we will talk about it more. I don't view curative liberalism as I describe it as something that happened in the mid-20th century. I do view its roots as being in Rousseau, but in my view, curative liberalism is not, as I understand it, is not in Locke. That would be my distinction.
I genuinely think it is in Locke, though, because Locke has a view based in the state of nature of how things he thinks ought to be objectively for all mankind everywhere. Right? You know, if he was carving out, and this is and it really is with Locke that it begins to be universal human rights, and it's a real problem. And the thing is, just to be clear, I think that like Hobbes, Locke, and probably even Rousseau would, with the modern knowledge that we have now, not adopt the positions they adopted, right? Because people forget that the intellectual history of the West is kind of a history of discovery as well, right? As in, you don't know until you encountered the consequences. I mean, I agree with Locke that, and the sensationalists and Condillac and all that, all of the knowledge we have about the world comes to our senses. And so if you are living in a highly restrictive feudal society, you'd be like, well, yeah, obviously we can do better than this. And I'm not saying it wasn't better, obviously, but they don't know what the consequences of this is going to be. It's completely unfair to expect them to foresee transgender activists running around with blue hair, tearing down statues of George Washington, right? Like, no, obviously they can't predict this.
Sure, yeah.
And so from their own perspective, yes, what they did was actually very reasonable, very sensible. I mean, this is why at the beginning of the 20th century, like basically every intellectual was a socialist, because obviously, yeah, the government can definitely do something about the poverty that we have here. We can definitely do something. They didn't know that they'd get the Blairite Revolution and we end up in the position that we're in now, right? They just didn't think that, and they wouldn't have held those positions if they'd known the things that we know. But they weren't the heirs to that. We're the heirs to that. And I think having an honest and like realistic accounting of the issues is actually long past time, and an admission where the assumptions that we've made have just failed. And like, for example, the socialists all knew the state of nature wasn't true, and they all carried the values anyway. And because there's something in the values that is genuinely, honestly, kind of religious. I mean, John Lennon's Imagine is a great example of this, where it is essentially the sort of religious blueprint of the boomer mindset that has carried us through to this. Oh, but imagine if there was no religion or hell or heaven or nations or suffering. It's like, what, in heaven? Like, imagine we were all just living in the afterlife in the Christian heaven. It's like, yeah, but we're not. And we're not going to live that, we live in reality. And you're lunatics. Not you personally, obviously.
No.
But all of this comes from the sort of milky Rousseauian view of the state of nature.
Definitely Rousseau, yeah.
Where everything was wonderful. I mean, just need to get back there.
Definitely Rousseau.
And so all of this progress is to get us back to the point of the state of nature. And the important thing, and this is why everything about liberalism is purely negative doctrine, right? It attacks relationships, because relationships are forms of unchosen bonds that put obligations on people that, and in many ways, they don't have a choice about, right? Your relationship to your country, your relationship to your parents, your neighbors, to the people around you in your local community. All of these, liberalism, as Rousseau puts it, these are chains that you're born free, but everywhere you're in chains. No one's born free. What are you talking about? None on earth are less free than a baby, right? None on earth. It's impossible to conceive of a free baby. It's a dead baby, unfortunately. It's a baby that's left in the woods to die.
So as Deneen puts it in Why Liberalism Failed, that the false anthropology is a massive problem, and that's one of the reasons, among many, that I am not a classic.
But it's the mythology that sets the values.
But no, let me just say what obviously anthropology and your account of human nature and your sort of political prescriptions for what we should do given such a nature, obviously they are going to be related to each other, and I'm not disputing that at all. But they can also, 400 years on, be subsequently disentangled in ways that aren't logic, that don't require us to tear down the whole structure. So so I think Patrick Deneen says in Why Liberalism Failed that the problem with the liberal anthropology is that it views human beings as wholes apart rather than parts of wholes.
Yes.
And that is a major problem. And it can lead to sort of like grotesque accounts of the sort of society we should live in. And so I definitely don't.
We're living in it.
We're living in it now. I definitely don't dispute that. But my view remains for now that Locke plays quite a mild role in that story.
Locke is by far from the worst of it, right? And Locke, like in his time, Locke was a revolutionary, but he was also someone who was hitting on something that a lot of people believed, right? His account is very persuasive. I mean, even now, if you read it now, it's a very persuasive account. Just I, as an Englishman, like, yeah, that seems right. That seems, and he's got the example of the Americas to draw upon, right? Yeah. So he's like, oh, look, this is what happens. People in the woods, they just build their log cabins and they start trading rationally with each other. Exactly.
Yeah.
Right? Or the blank slate people in the woods. Like, no, they're
and that was a mistake.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's,
but it was 17th century speculation, though.
Exactly. And it's not to demonize Locke. It's just that from the position that he's in, there's a lot of sophisticated thinking that has come afterwards that he didn't have access to, that would have made him challenge some of the assumptions that he had made. And he would have, not just with the philosophy of it, but the anthropology and science of it, would have come and gone, okay, yeah, no, that's not correct either. So a modern Locke would probably have the sort of Patrick Deneen position rather than the position of 17th century Locke, right? So I'm not, and same with all of them, frankly, because one of the things I want to stress is that all of these were genuinely brilliant thinkers.
Oh yeah.
Like visionary in many ways. It's just they had a wrong assumption that set a series of values. And honestly, it's the values that we have to detach from liberalism, right? Because obviously equality to a certain degree is valuable, right? I actually do not want to be hierarchically under an aristocratic class that I have to doff my hat to whenever they pass, right? I don't like that. You know, you can see why the levelers or the diggers were furious about it. They were
authority, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a free Englishman. Why do I have to do this, right? You can see, but they weren't liberals. You know, they were Protestant revolutionaries, right?
Yeah.
So they weren't liberals. They didn't. I mean, they had something akin to this same nature, but it was very religiously informed, and they would have followed whatever biblical prescriptions they were, right? The rational liberal perspective creates annexes a series of values that we need to steal back, right? Because obviously, I want liberty. But the question is, what does that actually mean in a context that doesn't begin with people in a state of perfect isolation? And so from a sort of properly right-wing position on liberty, obviously we want liberty, but liberty is not being alone in the woods, right? Liberty is having the ability to live within a community that accepts you and facilitates the ability to do certain things. Obviously that comes with a series of compromises, right? And equality is the same. Yeah, I want to have a vote, right? But I don't think that I should take that guy's property and have it, you know, or someone else take my property. So there's too much attached to these words, right? That we really have to be able to strip away.
I agree.
And that's going to be a very difficult thing.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I have the answer to that.
I think that is my view. It needs to be like we need to, but we should. It's a sort of disentangling operation of sorts. And one of the reasons why it's such a mess is as I think is implicit in your argument. The problem is that things have become very kind of ideologically hardened and inflexible. And but to that extent, I suppose I view your criticism of liberal ideology more as a criticism of ideology than of liberalism.
Oh, very much. I could apply this kind of criticism to any ideology.
Yeah, there you go.
Because I've done a lot of work on ideology.
And I share those criticisms of ideology.
Because the ideology itself is necessarily a problem in almost all times and all places. I mean, when ideology was first invented as a concept by the ideologues, Napoleon Bonaparte was a member. Did you know this?
Yeah.
And literally within like a couple of years, he was like, no, these armchair metaphysicians are a problem. Yeah. They need to go.
And he got some stuff done.
Exactly.
In my obituary to the late, great Peter Whittle, I wrote, and I wrote this because I think he understood this just about as well as anyone, God rest his soul. I think Peter understood that in order to save England, and indeed the broader West, on things particularly to do with replacement migration and sort of cultural vandalism and all the rest of it, and indeed being willing to take concerted political action in order to kind of set things right. But in order to save England, we need to be willing to act in ways to which Englishmen are unaccustomed. I sense you agree with that, but do you think we have it in us?
Yeah, I think actually we should do ourselves the favour and try to use fewer Latin words when we're talking about politics, right? So you'll notice that liberty and equality are both high-minded, abstract Latin words, but Anglo-Saxon words are actually a lot earthier and actually make more sense. So instead of liberty and equality, if I said I want freedom and belonging, then suddenly you understand what I mean, right? You know, I should be able to act in the way in my community that I want to act. It's up to them to deal with how I act. And suddenly you realize I've got a much more concrete sense of what I'm actually asking for. I'm not asking for my personal liberation from my physical body or the country or whatever. I'm asking to be left alone to act in the ways I think are best and to live how I think I ought to live, which assumes I come from a community, I am a kind of person, I have a set of rights. They might not be universal rights, but they are my rights, and I am part of a continuation of something, right? If I say freedom and belonging rather than liberty and equality, I'm still getting the same thing. I belong to the community of voters. I belong to the community of taxpayers, unfortunately. You know, I belong to the local parish of my church.
We could do with a curative onslaught against that.
I definitely could.
Yes.
My God. And I've got the freedom to engage with these things as I see fit, what I think is proper. And the people around me will think it's proper, and they'll make their judgments, and I'll change my mind based on those judgments and whatnot. And suddenly you realize we're away from the abstract Latin words, right? Like I'm not trying to, because liberty isn't an event; it's a state of being, right? But not necessarily the case. I mean, it is a state of being, but you know what I mean. It's very metaphysical, whereas I'm trying to talk about things that are much more personal and lower. And actually, I think the Anglo-Saxon words are a lot better for that. They make a lot more sense. And this is one of the reasons why Churchill always spoke in Anglo-Saxon words in his speeches. Very, very rarely uses Latin words because they're just alien. And there's something about the lizard brain of the Englishman that understands the Anglo-Saxon words are real words. And that talks about a real thing. It's very much to the ground. And I think that we could do well on the right by changing our discourse and just rejecting that kind of abstract way of thinking.
I'm going to have to rewrite all my essays.
I'm sorry. Well, I'm going to have to rewrite mine. It's only an idea that's come to me relatively recently, but I think it's important, actually.
Carl Benjamin, thank you.
My pleasure.